democratic system, well, quote unquote, advanced democratic society with quote unquote proper checks and balances. We see what's happening now. But in the Caribbean, these are newly independent countries. And so when we think about the role that Cambridge Analytica is playing in sort of exploiting this sort of, it's because it's new terrain for them, right? It is also exploited terrain because these people are not necessarily as digitally savvy as, say, political consultants or politicians in the United States, right? They see, an expert from the first world, right? And they would accept whatever sort of expertise, quote unquote, that these experts are going to bring in order to advance their very narrow and partisan political interests.
All right, we'll take one more question. Yes.
Dr. Tyree didn't answer.
I'll be really quick. So the effects of listening to hip hop are real on young women especially. There's study after study that talks about, heightened sexual activity. There's studies that talk about issues with identity formation. It's all over. There's no denying it. Part of what we have to do is you cannot stifle someone's creativity, and you can't stifle someone for telling who and what they are through music. But what you have to do is make sure that young women, or even other people who are listening to it, do so with a sense of understanding and media literacy. So that when we're talking about, 100 killers with 100 hammers, that doesn't mean go out and get 100 of your friends and let's go kill people. That's just songs and music. And so I think we have to understand that it is real. But what is also real is the plight of young African Americans in the inner city. And I live in the inner city, and I can tell you that 2 blocks from our house, most of you would not walk. But that is what it is, and we cannot pretend that it doesn't exist. So we do have to make sure, and if I had girls, and I have boys, but I make sure that when they do listen that they understand, the difference between fantasy and reality and consequences when you're listening to this type of music.
We really need to move on. They'll be here over lunch. You can talk to everybody individually. I appreciate it. So thank you, panel. This was wonderful. And we have one more session, then we're going to break for lunch. Like I said, we're running a little tight, so we're going to try to speed it up. And I see some members of my class here. I'm so happy to see you. So just make sure that you tweet or let me know in some way that you were here today, and because I can't keep track of everybody. So we're going to move on to our next session. Thank you, panel. Are you ready? Okay. And then Yannick Rice Lamb, and unfortunately, you all are at the time crunch.
By a company or an organization whose access is restricted only to those employees or members of that organization. Here are a couple of examples, and some of you may be familiar with some, Yammer, Socialcast, those kinds of things. And I'm not talking about Facebook within a corporation or a company. I'm talking about a specific enterprise medium that is only for those members and not for outsiders to use. The motivation behind my study is I wanted to understand enterprise social media use itself. Of course, the challenges behind that and what's important, the motivation of use by employees. Is it self-choice versus mandatory use? Also, the effects behind that. What are the outcomes of using enterprise social media, the job performance and psychological well-being? So that's specifically what my study looked at, is the outcomes, so the social side and what the outcomes are for that. The problem statement has to do with public social networking sites like Facebook and the enterprise social media that contend them Meaning, okay, so we want to have people get online, we want people to feel comfortable in order to, you're at work and you get online, you may be looking for information. However, you still want to be social. You want to get to know your colleagues. You want to know the people that you work with. However, some organizations don't allow you to use Facebook at work. That is forbidden, or outside Facebook, or your personal Facebook at work, so that's forbidden. So that contingent is what I'm interested in looking at, and is it truly, truly social? So the purpose, of course, is to build and test a model to explain enterprise social media use and behavior, and also to understand the motives behind why employees use those platforms. Two research questions are: what motivates an employee to use internal social media at the workplace? And of course, what is the relationship between employee internal social media use, performance, and well-being? There are a couple of theoretical contributions. I did utilize the uses and gratification theory, which does fit nicely within my research, because it will fill the gap in relation to the isolated view of technology and workplace social behavior. Of course, practically, you want to understand an employee's motivation for use, and of course, those that build those sites and build those applications, they want to know what's going to make an employee get onto my application at work. Is there a way that I can connect with my colleagues? Organizations can leverage, of course, to promote and increase job performance based on employee social behavior, and also other useful guidelines to implement ESM that address socialization, knowledge sharing. Again, the conceptual framework, the uses and gratification theory, also motivation, participation, performance, the framework, and then of course social capital. Again, that all kind of falls nicely within this study. To touch on the uses and gratification theory, the traditional studies by CATS points to three types of needs that are gratified by different media. Social, which is the connectedness to family and friends; hedonic, which is just pure enjoyment; and also cognitive, that knowledge seeking. I'm at work, I may need a colleague to send me some information on a project that I'm working on, and I just simply need to know that information. Or I'm gonna take some time, take a break, instead of walking outside, I just kind of get on and kind of search and see what's going on with some of my other colleagues in the workplace, and of course the social connections there. Basically, users are goal-oriented and select that certain media based on those particular needs. The motivation, participation, performance framework, of course, is the social side, to answer the questions of why and how and for what outcome people participate in social media. Of course, the motivations vary across individuals and link to an individual's knowledge, skill, and abilities to produce task-relevant behaviors. Again, I may have a different motivation to get on an enterprise social media network than someone else obviously. The social capital side of that framework, which I, of course, drew on from my study, the definition to that is the goodwill available to individuals or groups. Its source lies in the structure and content of the actor's social relations. Again, we're talking about that social connection. Overall connections and interactions between people, and it's characterized by the number and strength of existing network ties. Basically, expressive ties is the term that I'll use here on out, which is, I may be new to the organization, I don't have as many ties, I don't know as many people. However, how am I going to get to do that? When I get on enterprise social media, I may be able to connect with those people I may not know. I get to open up that network and become closer to my colleagues in that same vein. Based on previous bodies of research, the number of expressive ties mediates that psychological well-being and also your, in a sense, your social circle. My study model here, I just wanted to kind of break down. You have the user motivation, which is the social, hedonic, and cognitive. The participation ties, which again I talked about, are those ties within the friendship and emotional connections that you build. And also the user outcomes, the job improvement perception and psychological well-being. And I say job improvement perception because as an individual, I'm asking people what their perception is. I'm not asking their management or their leadership. They're going to give me the perception of what they feel using this ESM has done for them. Methodology, my research setting, I surveyed folks from MTurk, Amazon MTurk, and it was basically restricted to those who use enterprise social media. They had to go through a series of questions before they could actually get to the survey. So it was pretty stringent. I did a pre-survey just to make sure the questions were correct. And also the research design was quantitative and non-experimental, cross-sectional, web-based survey. 38 survey items and a 7-point Likert scale. Of course, level of analysis is individual. And the tools I used to look at the data was the structural equation model. Some of the limitations of the survey, which like many surveys, there are limitations. It was only introduced to a certain group of people in the United States, so maybe some future research could look at those outside of the United States and how people use enterprise social media. Of course, cross-sectional design may be insufficient for making causal inferences. And also at the macro level, I'm looking at the bigger level, specific sharing or collaboration actions can be another future area to research. So once I collected the data, just some of the demographics, I did have 320 respondents. However, looking at the data, you always have to clear some of that out. Some people didn't answer certain questions. So 298 was the total. Average age, 25-34. There were 49% males and 51% females responded. There were 70% in the private sector, and they were on the job between 1 and 5 years. And 53% of them held bachelor's degrees. And the frequency of use from all these folks was 48% that used it every day. So some of the major findings, I had 11 hypotheses, and so actually 3 of them were not supported. And all of them had to do with cognitive motivation. Again, I kind of touched on that word cognitively. You're looking for the knowledge. You're just looking for something I needed right now. It's not the pleasure, the enjoyment, that kind of thing. That was not supported, meaning that cognitive motivation had no significant relationship between the expressive ties that you had at the workplace. Thus, did not improve the job performance and also the well-being. This motivation is simply to seek knowledge. Also, social and hedonic motivations were shown to have a positive effect on an employee's job performance and well-being. So basically, expressive ties matter. You could be, like I said, if you're new to a job and you don't know anyone, of course that's going to be a little bit difficult. Sometimes you have to get out and walk through the office and learn to meet other folks. But as a practitioner, you can use that with the ESM, enterprise social media, getting people to know and learn about each other. So therefore, the expressive ties matter in the workplace, much like public networks like Facebook and Twitter. Just think about how you use Facebook and how you use Twitter, same social networks. Some future work can look at a longitudinal approach to understanding how ESM use changes over time. Again, this study only looked at snapshot in time, and if that effect changes over time. Also, the study can look at social connections, pre-implementation of ESM, and again, post-implementation. My study focused on folks who have already had an enterprise social media application in at their workplace, and they've been using it for years. So you, again, maybe looking at before it's implemented and then afterwards, and then seeing if that's important. I appreciate everyone's, look at that. I appreciate everyone's time. Thank you so much.
So we're going to have one more speaker, and then we're going to break for lunch. So we have Professor Yana Rice-Blank, and then we'll have a brief moment for some questions, just really brief, and then we're going to break, and then we're going to have our keynote speaker. We're going to hear a little bit from the director for the Cybersecurity Education and Research Center here at Howard, and we'll get on with the afternoon. And this is our Twitter handle up there.
Good afternoon. I realize that I'm standing between you and lunch, so I'll keep this relatively brief. My presentation is entitled Insecure Voices, Self-Censorship in Cyberspace. I have a question for you. How many of you or people close to you have ever kind of hesitated to retweet something or send a message on social media because you were concerned about the response, or you just didn't want to be bothered at the time or didn't want to have to deal with it in your stream? Okay. So that's one of the areas I'm interested in looking at, so this is kind of preliminary. And I know that's happened to me as well. Sometimes I've hesitated to retweet something or to send a message out on social media because I was busy and didn't want that polluting my stream at the time, or just didn't want to have to deal with responding to those things. Although I enjoy live tweeting a lot of events and different things and retweeting a great deal, and I'm on social media quite a bit. But I was kind of astounded to hear a few people that I know who are on, even way more than I am, who have hesitated to do that, sometimes because their messages have been misconstrued. So if you look at it from our standpoint, this is kind of the benign, if you think of it as a tumor, it's kind of a benign situation, and then all the way to a malignancy where it affects people's lives and the threat of their well-being. So some of the reasons for attack, as we know, happen because of race or gender, things that people may have covered in the media, comments about Trump, comments about Nicki Minaj, voter suppression or misdirection, comments construed as being negative or being misconstrued. Some people have mentioned that they were well-meaning, but something they said was misconstrued by a group that they actually were in favor of, and they decided to just leave it alone and they won't comment on that topic anymore. Efforts to silence diverse voices overall. So whether this is by race, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, religion, political views, or any way that you would like to slice it. So one of the problems, according to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, they say the online safety of women journalists goes beyond gender equality and press freedom, directly impacting the quality of our democracies and right of society to access a plurality of information. So put another way, cyber attacks and self-censorship that we may do on our own, they threaten democracy, the free flow of information, having varied voices, digital activism, and our health and well-being, because in some cases, as I mentioned, it can be stressful and it can be life-threatening. And so some of this is also related to the spiral of silence theory, so it's not exactly new, but one of the things I'm interested in seeing how it's taken off, particularly under Trump and some of the other attacks that have kind of grown in number since then. And the Pew Research Center, they did a study looking at social media related to Snowden and the NSA in 2014, and it showed that a lot of people were more willing to say things in person than they were on social media. And they also looked at that dynamic in 2012, and some people were also trying to look at it since 2016, since the presidential election. So a few years ago, one of our keynote speakers for this conference was Dr. Michelle Ferrier. And she's gone from being troll to busting trolls. So she has an organization called Troll Busters, she's received several awards for that. And she describes it as a just-in-time rescue service for women writers and journalists. She's also the dean of the School of Journalism and Graphic Communications at FAMU. So it started for her, she's experienced this personally because she was the first African-American columnist at a newspaper in Florida. And she, very well-meaning, she was trying to write about ways to bring people together, and she used some of her own personal information as examples. But then she endured 2 to 3 years of being harassed and having her family unsafe. So since that time, she's become a champion of safety on social media. She's also part of the Freedom of the Media representative for OSE, which I mentioned, the organization I mentioned earlier, and a supporter of the campaign for safety of female journalists online, or the hashtag SOFJO. So if this cooperates with me, I want to show you a clip that kind of shows the extreme that she went through.
Ultimately, learned to protect myself with firearms so that when I went out in public, I would be able to protect myself.
So you can see she got to the point where she had to carry a gun around doing that. She also was involved, I went to JAWS recently, which is the Journalism and Women Symposium in Williamsburg last
Despite being a
weekend.
sought-after Hollywood star, Michelle Pfeiffer manages to fly mostly under the radar. Fiercely private, yet totally captivating on screen, she invites a certain intrigue that makes you wish you knew more about her.
Okay, that was not what I wanted to show you.
Interviews. Not only is the star notoriously private, but in an interview with director Darren Aronofsky for Interview magazine, Pfeiffer admitted she dislikes the idea that actors are obligated to do interviews. She jokingly asked, "Did anyone forewarn you that I'm maybe like the worst interviewee that ever was?" She then went on to detail her less than enthusiastic approach to interviews, telling Aronofsky, "I thought it was very clever to have you because I usually don't feel any responsibility to give up anything. I sort of bide my time until the interview is over, and I can be pretty withholding. But now, because I like you, I have to make an effort."
I'm trying to figure out how to
Possible TV return. As part of Variety's
I have thought about coming off social media, but then people who actually are there who want information, which is the most important thing for me, then they lose. And then I lose. So what's the point of that?
It's a really dark place to be in, and if you're stuck in it for a really long time, I think it has severe repercussions on a person. I'm just really, really thankful and grateful that I wasn't stuck in that dark place for a long time.
Sorry about that, where that took us someplace else. But anyway, that's a Dark Place is a new documentary that's looking at some of the things that women are facing in Europe. And it explores several countries. And if in one clip, it shows people attacking the radio station. There's a woman how some glass enclosed radio stations, they literally ram and shatter the glass. And a lot of women had to go into hiding, but they are persistent in trying to get out the news and to defend different things. So the woman was shown earlier on the slide. She's based in Turkey. So another area of this, we have Twitter traps where people have been misusing messages. So they would start with tweets that say, "Stop police brutality," or something like that, that may attract a lot of African Americans and then literally kind of send you down a rabbit hole. Or they were looking at ways for voter suppression or sending out messages saying that avoid the lines or that you could, text something to vote. And they had them in different languages, targeted to African Americans, targeted to Latinos, and targeted by different race and ethnicity. Some of those messages were taken offline, but some of them kind of persisted, and unfortunately some people did listen to some of those. In terms of countering cyber attacks, a number of organizations, committees to protect journalists, as well as troll busters, they have online protection, and one of the things that they were calling, Dr. Ferry was calling, was practicing digital hygiene and learning how to respond to some of these things and also protecting yourself in the first place. One of the things that they try to do is also to counter some of the negative messages with positive messages to kind of get in the stream and counteract that. And also like taking warning shots where the people know that they're being monitored and that they're aware that their identity is being revealed so that they could be forwarded to the authorities if necessary. And then also helping people to ignore it, because sometimes people, you have to step away from it and not pay attention to it so that it doesn't affect you so much and become as stressful. And then finding their identity of the people who are doing it, supporting the campaign. One of the things that's come up that's been a little controversial is encouraging students in particular and young adults to change their online ID and to kind of suppress it. I only have two more slides. Partly because one of the things that even here we teach people is to try to develop your online presence and do it professionally, because a lot of employers are looking for that. So that kind of runs counter to that. I'm kind of curious what some of you think about that. They also have these areas too where it's asking if you're being harassed online and then showing you different steps to counter that. Okay. And you can see the worst thing about censorship is that it really blacks out our voices. Thank you for your time.
and then we're going to break for lunch. And I know you've all been here patiently. I appreciate everybody. I think we've had a lot of good information starting off the day, and it's all given us food for thought, directions for research. And I always love this conference, I tell you, because I always learn something new. Any questions for our panel, our presenters? Oh, y'all are just hungry, right?
Oh, we were that good. How's
Yeah,
that?
we'll see. Other than that glitch.
Oh,
No, actually, that's might be something I need to take a look at. I was just chatting with my colleague over here next to me, and we were talking about that internal piece where it can be difficult to get outside of the ESM. You're kind of stuck in this bubble, so I think that might be a good direction to go to. Yeah.
one more question back there.
Earlier there was a presentation you have concept like surveillance, like this idea of calling somebody out, and then the most recent presentation was kind of about like being harassed and being like changing one's identity almost to sort of prevent that harassment. And I guess my kind of question is like how do we balance like a need to bring attention to issues and then also kind of dealing with how we're really making us vulnerable online. Because you ask the question like, have you not expressed something because you think someone else might counter you, or they might figure out the context, or they might, you know, or there might be harassment. It's kind of like, how do we address these issues? Because they seem like, on the one hand, we're trying to empower people to identify issues. And you know, we just heard earlier some presentation about rappers bringing out these messages, but also like I forget the woman's name who is a reporter, and then she's being harassed. I guess it's just like I don't have a question. How do we deal with this?
Someone mentioned the 1619 project earlier, and so Nicole Hannah-Jones is very active. She spearheaded that project and at the New York Times, and she's very active online. And the community that follows her, they kind of chime in when people make negative comments about things that she says or research that she presents that people may disagree with. And she's very precise with her research, and then they kind of back her up. So there's kind of a community around her supporting her. And I think that's one of the things that Michelle Ferrier was advocating as well, is to kind of flood the stream, support people, kind of like you silence the trolls. And then keep reporting them, because some of the examples that I mentioned also, those people were persistent in making sure that Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or whatever took them down, and calling out other people who were circulating them.
And Dr. Akpan? Okay.
That presentation, while I was sitting there, I learned something about censorship online. My question is this: coming from a country where you're not very free, I just did a presentation on how the social media, you know, has taken over the role of being the mainstream media, and talking about traditional media in terms of breaking of news, that they don't need to go through the journalistic aspect of it. Now, my question is this: why would somebody want to censor his or opinion on the social media in a advanced democratic setting as the democracy of America, knowing that you have the freedom of speech, you have the freedom to practice anything you want to practice? And back in Nigeria, there are some things you can put on the social media because you know that if you do that, they might come after you. It's either the government or the private business ownership. Why they fear in an environment that promotes freedom of speech? And then secondly, academically speaking, I know you use Elizabeth Newman theory of spiral of silence. Can we also say that the theoretical aspect of the gatekeeping theory of the mass media could be the reason an individual would kind of censor what he or she churns out within the public domain, the social media? Thank you.
Please keep your answers short. because we're running
Okay.
right into our lunch period.
Okay. I think in some cases, from a lot of things that I've been reading and talking to people, particularly among women and people of color, some of the censorship, even with the democracy, are for safety reasons, because they've been physically stalked. People have come to their homes, people have, learned their identities and come to their workplaces, followed them around places, and they've been threatened. And that's why Michelle, in her case, she was, carrying a gun. And that's pretty, extreme for people to have to do that based on something that you've written to share with the public and try to unite the public. So I think that's why, and I think when people see things that happen to other people, that may give them pause, or they just don't want to go down that road for people who've been severely hassled. One of the persons that I cited earlier, I said she's very active online, but it just turned south and she didn't want to deal with that at the time.
Okay.
But she does speak out a lot about a lot of things.
All right, I want to thank you all. You're such a good audience, and we have such good presenters and panelists. We're going to take a break for lunch. We're going to try to come back. We do have some wiggle room during lunch, so we're going to try to come back at least by 1:10, because it's already 12:42. So that gives you about 20, 30 minutes for lunch. And then we're going to hear from Rebecca Goolsby, and we're going to hear also a word from Bob Burke at the Cyber Security Education and Research Center here at Howard. So enjoy yourself, and I'll give you the cues when you're due back. Thank you very much.